How to Hide a Body. Burying and Unearthing Trauma by Ecclesia Baum. Part 1. Death. Chapter 2. Survival Mode. None of these methods of disposal, denial, hiding, obsessing, are sustainable through our normal way of life and our normal thought processes. In all cases, we find ourselves making changes to our lifestyle and mindset in order to find the emotional energy to deal with our trauma and to create an environment for ourselves that just barely meets the requirements for our survival. The moment that we chose to handle the body ourselves, we chose a life that can only be prolonged by adopting a mindset of whatever it takes. Whether we consciously identify what has changed about our new post-trauma self or whether we do it subconsciously, we always try to reconcile the difference in us by whatever means necessary. Let us take a look at the various ways that we try to cope. Manipulation. One of the biggest changes we feel is a loss of control. Whether caused by the physical or emotional abuse of a loved one, the violence of a stranger, the horrors of war, the loss of someone or something dear, the heavy hand of Mother Nature, or whatever it may be, traumatic events remove our sense of control. Most of us had plans for our lives, or at least a sense of cause and effect. What are we to do when the standard rules of cause and effect no longer work? How are we supposed to act knowing that the equal and opposite reaction that follows any given action can be eclipsed entirely by someone or something else? Most of us aren't content with just succumbing to the unpredictability of life and leaving our lives to fate. Thus, we grapple for any scrap of control we can find. In this case, I don't mean control in the way that a tyrant rules a country, but in the way that a man builds a fence. We look for control the way we pack 6 outfits for a 2-day trip because we don't know what we may need, the way we buy 3 cases of water bottles ahead of hurricane season when we still have cases from last year, the way we drive below the speed limit when we see a cop in the mirror when we could just go the speed limit. It isn't control for the sake of power, that will be discussed a little later, but it is control for the sake of safety, motivated by fear. It is our sometimes calculated, sometimes frantic attempt to keep our personal history from repeating itself. It is us struggling to create an outcome that is, if not desirable, at least predictable. When we are traumatized by the actions of another person against us, it affects the way we interact with people. If we have suffered something like a breach of trust or are injured by the words or actions of others, or when a relationship is terminated in a painful and unexpected way, then we come to the conclusion that without people there is no pain. We begin to regulate the space between us and others, physically or emotionally. We hold people at arm's length. We socially distance ourselves in every sense of the phrase, keeping 6 feet away, never touching, and often covering our mouths. Sometimes we push people away aggressively. Fear and wrath are linked. We respond with aggression when we feel threatened in order to intimidate or to give ourselves a slight advantage in a fight or to keep fear from paralyzing us and thereby making us vulnerable. We bare our teeth and growl and snap like a cornered dog, even when we aren't cornered. We don't hurt people just as a byproduct of our standoffishness, but we hurt people deliberately. We say terrible things we don't always mean. We act out violently because it's better for us to be feared than to be a target. We commit atrocities in spite of the consequences. We swing wildly at those around us, all to scream to the world, "Stay away!" All because proximity is, to us, a threat. Sometimes we don't distance ourselves from everyone unilaterally, but instead distance ourselves from a segment of the population that resembles the person or people who hurt us. A woman who has been sexually abused by a man may distance herself from men, but act normal around women, for example. If we don't identify the generalizations that we make to protect ourselves, we risk alienating and forming prejudices against those that we believe are like our abusers. It isn't correct to assume that all men are a threat, or to assume that all preachers are a threat, or to assume that anyone of a certain race is a threat, and it isn't fair to treat them that way. It isn't correct to assume any group of people are a threat based on our experiences with one person, and it isn't fair to treat them that way. We fail to understand that every individual is different, and we hurt people with our assumptions in the process. Whether we push people away individually, in segments, or en masse, our actions may not always be met with understanding or sympathy, and we hurt and alienate people. In short, even though we think we have valid reasons, our reasons aren't enough to keep our behavior from being interpreted as sexist, racist, bigoted, biased, etc. Our reasons don't make us right. We cannot make ourselves unapproachable, and we especially can't allow ourselves to be offensive, considering one of our two main purposes in life is to be a witness of God. This sort of isolating behavior doesn't just hurt those around us, but it hurts us as well. No man is an island. We need other people. If we fail to recognize this, we stay alone with our thoughts, alone in our time of need, and alone as we undertake the frightening ordeal of seeing how our lives end. Without the benefit of other people's perspectives and kindness, we become maddening company to ourselves, and we become mentally and socially malnourished as we continue to gnaw on the same old thoughts. If we do recognize that we need other people, then for the sake of socialization, we become con men. We create the impression of openness and availability in exchange for the practical uses of people. We may not regulate the distance between us and others, but instead we regulate the depth. We love the people that we call friends in the same way that we love a pet. We appreciate their companionship. We appreciate the safety that comes with an extra set of eyes. We understand their needs and will do anything to help them. We'll even put ourselves in harm's way for them, but we only trust them as far as we think they can understand. We don't tell them about the deep pains of our heart. We aren't able to share things with them in the same way that they share with us. Like a beloved puppy, they are in a total state of vulnerability to us, and we are only vulnerable from the ankles down. That's not to say that we ought to share everything. No one shares everything. And that's not to say every relationship has to be exactly 50-50, but we must recognize that we can't build a close relationship on a one-way street. A person may accidentally find a one-way street without realizing what kind of street it is, but eventually the signs become obvious. Whereas a pet is not fully aware or not very concerned with the imbalance of power in the owner-pet relationship, a person can see the gaps in their understanding of us. When they see the empty spaces in the persona we create, they may not be able to trust us, or they may feel too betrayed to continue the charade. Our intentions aside, no one likes to feel conned. When that sense of trust is lost and left unrepaired, and it will stay unrepaired until we can be honest with them, and probably more honest with them than we needed to be in the first place, we lose that threadbare sense of connectedness that was just barely meeting our emotional needs as social creatures. Many of us are already a part of social contracts whose terms are already predetermined, whether by blood relation, by affiliation, or by years of closeness. Nevertheless, the pre-established nature of such a relationship doesn't always make us feel secure in and of itself. Sure, we don't need to worry about proximity or depth so much, since those parameters are already set, but we instead worry ourselves with trajectory. Where will they go? What will become of them and consequently our relationship? We begin to try to direct the other party, to regulate them in order to protect them. We try to control those that we consider family. In our pursuit of security, we become hypervigilant over the ones closest to us, as though our restless need to know every aspect of their lives could keep them by our sides, as if our overprotectiveness will always be able to protect them. Perhaps we've experienced a loss or a near loss of a loved one. We tell ourselves, had we been more diligent, had we paid more attention back then, had we done something differently, things wouldn't be like this. We start to micromanage our spouses, our siblings, our parents, our kids, our significant others, our subordinates, even our friends. Anyone that we feel some responsibility towards becomes a target of our overprotectiveness, and in any quantity. Overprotectiveness doesn't only select one target. Sometimes we manage people in pairs, keeping tabs on relationships, or sometimes we nominate ourselves the so-called glue that keeps a group together. Whether it's 1 or 2 or 99, we grapple with the potential for disaster by doing everything in our power to steer the lives of others in what we consider to be the right direction. As impossible as it is to control our own fates, it is doubly as impossible to control another's, and sometimes the things we think that we do for their own good are really only for ourselves. Is the way that we keep tabs on our spouses and shelter our kids something that makes them happy, or does it just give us some relief? I'll answer that question with another question. Why on earth would our constant interference be something that makes them happy? It's too easy for our family and people close to us to misunderstand our intentions when we act overprotective. They may see our fear for their safety as mania. Are they wrong? And it will drive a wedge between us and them. They will wander away from our influence and begin to hide things from us, not because they are things that need to be hidden, but because they want to have some scrap of agency or privacy, or because they don't want us to freak out. We can be so wrapped up in our own overprotectiveness that we don't even realize that our children see our anxiety as something that needs to be tiptoed around and mitigated and diffused. The people we try to manage are actually the ones managing us. How sad to be considered a threat by the ones we want to protect. They don't see us as a safe harbor like we believe ourselves to be, but a restless sea that churns disproportionately beneath the wing beats of every passing gull, and they feel the need to man the helms of their lives with extreme caution every time they have to navigate near us. Children, due to their innate vulnerability, often become collateral damage from our compulsions. We become helicopter parents that hover around on standby for the moment they need us to life flight them out of a situation, and the sound of our propellers erases their voices. The constant whipping of the wind destabilizes them. It's true that children are not adults, and that they do need the assistance and guidance of adults in their lives. However, it's also true that children don't always have the mental or emotional ability to recognize and protest our constant over-involvement, nor do they have the power and the independence to walk away from us like an adult may. As our children get older, they are more likely to begin to recognize our behavior as irrational. They may begin to dismiss not just our anxious tendencies, but everything else too. When our waves roar at every boat, they begin to believe that even storms must be like boats. When we have so many unjustifiable fears, they begin to think that our justifiable fears must be unjustifiable. We insult their competence, their ability to tell a sail from a storm cloud, and push them to anger. We squeeze too tightly, and the only thing that they may feel that they can do is wriggle free until they are out of our hands. Or they may do the opposite. They become enabled. We are promoted from backseat driver to chauffeur. If we are going to fight their battles, why would they lift a finger to defend themselves? If we're going to manage their schedules, why would they take any initiative to keep their lives in order? We pare away at their ambition until they have only ours to govern their lives. We pare away at their ability to trust in themselves and saddle them with insecurity so unshakable that they don't feel comfortable taking their own reins. We keep taking their responsibilities and decisions out of their hands to the point that they automatically begin to forfeit them to us. Fearfully or willfully, they choose the road of least resistance that we present to them time and time again. We create incompetent people just to soothe ourselves. When all of the control is forfeited to us, it doesn't even make us happy. The environment we create is a breeding ground for conflict. We become bitter, we become exhausted by our efforts, and we blame the other for exhausting us. Even though we originally chose to take on such a task, we see their lack of exertion, and it makes us suddenly aware of how much energy we're using. In addition, the other person may become bitter towards us. When we are at the helm of another's life and end up steering them into misfortune, the other person will very likely blame us. If we didn't make them do this, or if we had let them do that, things wouldn't be so terrible, they think. And are they wrong? Logically, it could be argued that their life could have been just as bad or worse had we not intervened, but at the same time, we should not have shouldered the responsibility if we weren't ready to shoulder the failure and suspicion. We tried to determine their fate despite our short-sightedness. We abused power that wasn't even ours to begin with, and for that, we are to blame. We didn't take their misery, we only took their accountability. Authority and accountability are inseparable, and when the day comes that they hold us accountable, they may choose to leave us just as we'd always feared. We may ironically lose the people we tried to hold on to because we tried to hold on to them. But even if our energy and our will and their patience and their yielding outlive the breakdown of this system of control that we've invented, there's always the chance that all of the participants won't. Just as we can't control our fate, we can't control theirs. And if we can't keep them alive, then what? How do we expect to recover from the pain of a loss that we worked so hard to prevent? We can't even deal with the pain of loss that we didn't put in the work to avoid. Do we really think we can handle that kind of pain again when we're still reeling from our original wound? What if they die as they act in defiance of our overprotection? Will we ever be able to forgive ourselves for unintentionally pushing them away? What if it's suicide? What if our overbearing presence in their lives is one of the stressors preceding it? Or what if our unapproachability caused them to hide the pain? What if they were too scared to tell us what they'd gotten involved in? We think we're taking away the risk of loss by trying to reduce the moving parts, but for every danger we remove, we add another. We are just inventing new ways for ourselves to regret. We are inventing new ways to hurt. And just as we can't control the fate of another, we can't control ours. And when we're dead and gone, then what? Will the people we tried to protect know how to live on without us? We do an injustice by trying too hard to shield people from the world, only to leave them alone in it, unprepared. I don't suggest that we should just coldly make the ones we love fend for themselves in order to practice for a day when we're gone. There's nothing wrong with being a soft place to land when they need it. There is something wrong with becoming a padded room that they can't escape. We need to have balance. We can be a crutch every now and then. As the song says, we all need somebody to lean on. But we're being unfair when we remove someone's leg so we can become their prosthetic. We're being unfair when we cripple someone just so they can't live without us. And even if that isn't our goal, that's what we do. Sometimes we don't feel that our suffering is rooted in our failure to manage people correctly, but in our unpreparedness. Our gut reaction then becomes to over-prepare. We are weighed in a balance against our worst nightmares, and everything that we learn and every skill we acquire tilts the scale in our favor. We may delve into study, learn all we can, eavesdrop, stalk people online, all for the sake of knowledge, because the more we know, the safer we feel. I was hurt because I was ignorant, but I won't get caught off guard again, we think to ourselves. Actually, this isn't a wholly terrible way to think. It's true that knowledge is power, and learning about things that hurt us can be a healthy way to help ourselves come to terms with what happened to us. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be writing this book. But as with anything, we need moderation. We can't afford to become arrogant in our knowledge. Sometimes we assume that we know best and sabotage opportunities to grow and enjoy things and enjoy people because we don't know how to handle our knowledge. There are things that we need to know, and there are things that we do not need to know. We need to know the ways that we hurt ourselves so that we can stop hurting ourselves. We don't need to know the court records of everyone around us. We don't need to know the bad things someone said on Facebook 2 years ago. We don't need to examine everyone and everything until we found every minuscule flaw. Everything begins to look gruesome and strange when we put it under a microscope. We can take a water sample from the most beautiful shore, put it under a microscope, and zoom in until we can no longer see the water, only the microscopic organisms that live in it. We don't know what they are or what they do, but we don't like them. Before we saw the plankton and the bacteria, we didn't mind swimming, but now that we have, swimming in the water makes us uneasy. Why? Did the water change? Or was it just that we looked too hard and learned something that we didn't have the context to interpret fairly? When we look at people with too much scrutiny, their flaws and their past failures become huge to us, and we forget that these are just small parts of a human soul that is ever-changing and ever-developing. We don't see the ways that our lives could potentially change for the better if we'd make them a part of it because we can't give them the benefit of the doubt. We don't need to gather knowledge to weaponize. Sometimes it's true that the reason we were hurt in the past was because of our own ignorance or inability, and there isn't anything wrong with learning in order to become stronger, but we need to be careful and understand our intentions. Are we learning for self-improvement? Are we studying the law so that we can hold our own in a legal dispute? Are we studying psychology so that we can better understand ourselves and help ourselves and others? Are we learning to swim to overcome our fear of the water? Or are we listening to gossip so that if we get bad attention, we can deflect it onto someone else? Are we eavesdropping and scrolling and sifting through people's words so that we have dirt on them if they ever cross us? Are we pressing people to open up to us just so that we can manipulate them with their own insecurities one day? Are we finding the best way to avenge ourselves and permanently remove a threat? Are we creating dossiers for those around us? Is our knowledge arrows in our quiver instead of strength in our bones? Is the knowledge we gain only good as a weapon? Knowledge is power, and any power can be abused. Our need for control can taint noble pursuits and disfigure them into obsessions and joyless ambitions. Instead of a confidant, we are a double agent. Instead of researching, we are hunting. Instead of learning self-defense, we are learning assault. We need to recognize when we have the wrong intentions and recognize that the malice and the aggression with which we wield our newfound skills and knowledge and expertise are bound to hurt someone, often undeservedly and often grievously. As I had stated before, we become arrogant. We think we know who to strike and how deep to cut, as though social interactions are combat situations, and we cross the line. We think we are perfect judges because we've sharpened our claws to exact judgment, but we're still just scared and wounded creatures. We aren't striking for justice, we are striking for fear. Maybe the two will coincidentally align every now and then, but more often than not, it's just the fear. It isn't right for us to treat each other this way. We are supposed to be gentle and think of the good. How hypocritical is it for us to be reeling and suffering from unjust pain and then prepare to deal unjust pain to others? As much as we wish someone had been gentle with us, as much as we hope people will still be gentle with us, why is it so hard to be gentle also? Why is it so hard to be gentle with ourselves? Sometimes we prepare ourselves at our own expense. We may feel the inexplicable need to expose ourselves to the knowledge of horrors similar to what we've experienced, or even greater horrors, in order to desensitize ourselves to pain and normalize our own feelings. Is it really good for our mental health to read so many sad stories? Is it really good for us to keep forcing ourselves to relive the pain? We engage in emotional self-harm as a way to try to make ourselves callous to the sort of trauma we've experienced. If this was boxing, we're effectively taking hits like it will make us a strong boxer, not realizing that it's just making us a punching bag. We are not learning to fight back against anything. We're just trying to harden our own hearts, and a hardened heart breaks worse than a tender one. Something will inevitably break us, and ironically, it will probably be the first thing that broke us. In the end, no amount of self-inflicted anguish desensitizes us to our initial weak spot. We don't need to gather knowledge in order to do harm, regardless of whether the victim is another person or us. We form new reflexes to try to protect ourselves. Returning to the metaphor of hiding a body, we develop new habits around the house to keep our corpses unnoticed. We plant or don't plant over the makeshift grave when we would normally treat it like any other part of the yard. We move belongings from one closet to another in order to make hiding places. We don't buy frozen food so that the corpse can take the whole freezer. We change our habits and routines that used to be so ingrained. We don't go to certain places anymore. We make sure we are never in a situation where we can be cornered. We read too much into the subtext of other people's actions for fear of them suddenly lashing out at us. We avoid crowded areas. Like a mistreated dog, we flinch at anything that seems to be a raised hand. Sometimes we realize when we've flinched and it makes us feel weak. Sometimes we realize that others have seen us flinch and we feel ashamed. Still, we believe that the potential shame from an unwarranted flinch is better than not flinching and being left open to attack. We find security in having our guard up at all times because it means that we are the deciding factor in any assault against us. We raise the shield too often, but it's our hands that do it, so we are still the ones in control. Not every reflex is something that could save us, however. Even though we backtrack and try to explain the benefit of an action sometimes, in all truth, we generally tend to act because we feel comfort in the action itself and not because it has any particular benefit. Maybe a reflex could seem like a masterful adaptation or a wise decision or a symbolic gesture, but mostly it's just something to make us feel a little better. It is an immediate and thoughtless action that we perform mainly to soothe ourselves. But not every self-soothing behavior is a big deal, nor is it something that needs to be fixed. As for me, when I'm under a lot of stress or upset about something, I rub my shoulder or the back of my neck or massage the old sprain on my left wrist. These habits have no intrinsic benefits, but they also don't really impact my life, so there's no need to change. I touch and scratch at my face more when I'm anxious, which has the side effect of making my face more prone to breakouts. I try not to do this for the health of my skin, but the impact is mainly cosmetic, so it's not a priority to me. Still, our reflexes can potentially impact our quality of life. We spend our energy and resources on fruitless rituals, and we often embarrass ourselves and give ourselves one more thing to be self-conscious about. Maybe I'll decide that it doesn't matter one way or another. After all, they are my habits and it's my life, but maybe I'll try harder to not touch my face now that everyone I know can read this book and know my habits. I'm a private person, so for me, everyone automatically recognizing that I'm anxious would be embarrassing, even if the act of touching my face or rubbing my neck is relatively low risk. Just the feeling of extra scrutiny would be exhausting to me, so I'll probably make efforts to downplay my nervous tics in the future. I don't really want my every move to be scrutinized and for people to say, it's because she's traumatized. She must still not be over it. Let's be honest. Our lives are already hard enough without having to explain to people why we react the way we do and further draw attention to something we really don't want to talk about. It is hard to live a relatively normal life with reflexes that give us away. We need to be cognizant of the way we have adapted to the aftermath of trauma, and we need to figure out which behaviors are normal reactions that we once lacked and now have attained, which behaviors are abnormal and tiring us out, and which behaviors are inconsequential, even if they are a little different. We don't need to keep exhausting ourselves. We may feel that we've lost control of our feelings. We feel tossed about in the waves of depression, anxiety, anger, or grief that rage in the aftermath of the storm, and we do anything we can to steady ourselves. Many of us turn to drugs or alcohol. When I say drugs, I'm not just referring to coke or meth. I mean any drug we use as a crutch, whether recreational or medical, whether off the streets or over the counter, whether prescribed or homemade, whether doctor recommended or prohibited by law. It's so easy to find a chemical to lean on, to temporarily dull the pain of life, to hold the memories at bay, to calm our anxiety or depression or cognitive dissonance or existential dread, or, if not to give us a high, to at least elevate us to normal. Still, even as coming down becomes more and more like a crash landing, even as we wish we were at least in the sorry state that we were in before the addiction instead of the disaster we are now, we can't turn away. Even if we aren't abusing substances, we may still find ourselves in a place of dependency. It's easy to find something that can take the edge off, because it doesn't even have to be a drug. When we see something or do something that we like, we feel good. This is a normal, natural response, but we can abuse this system. We are in an anxious and vulnerable state, and we find something that can quickly soothe us or calm us or at least distract us, perhaps something like shopping, gambling, media, or pornography. We do that thing, and for a moment we feel okay, so the next time we feel stressed out, we reach for it again and again and again. We reach more and more often and find ourselves addicted in a way that's difficult to measure. We engage in the same self-medicating behaviors as someone addicted to drugs or alcohol does, and our vices begin to interfere with our lives just as a drug habit would, forcing us to make excuses, forcing us to sneak around, costing us money and time and credibility and self-esteem and social standing in relationships. We begin to lose our grip because our addiction makes us work harder and harder to get the same satisfaction that we did at the start. Our mind and our bodies automatically acclimate to the things we expose it to, so that the things that were once novel and sensational, begin to get stale. Addiction is a cruel pharmacist that raises the prices and lowers the dose every time we visit. The same things that brought us a fleeting reprieve from pain are never as effective as they once were, and one hit doesn't hit the same as the one before. For a person who isn't in constant pain, who is secure in their joy and can bear the lows in their lives openly, they may simply say to themselves, that was fun, but now I have other things to do, or I used to like that, but now it's boring, or even, that felt good, but I shouldn't have done it, and I don't want to do it again. But for those of us who don't live so simply, it's not enough. We can't bear the low again after the high, because we begin to think too much. Our lows are too low to survive without something lifting us back up again. So then what? We spend more. We risk more. We find things that are more sensational, more enthralling, more explicit. We up the dosage, which can be catastrophic when our vices are physical. We push our intake to levels that our body or our mind or our finances or our lifestyle can't handle. We may even put our own lives at risk, and even if we do somehow survive, we may not recover. There can be long-term ramifications when we push past our limits, physically or otherwise. God doesn't always take away every consequence. Unless God chooses to extend His mercies to our situation, we will reap what we sow. Addiction leaves its scars one way or another. Breaking an addiction to legal and socially acceptable things presents its own unique challenges. There isn't always a clear delineation between acceptable pastimes and excessive pastimes, so it's more difficult both to realize that we've become addicted and to find motivation to break it. There aren't government programs to intervene and push us to be sober and television-free. There aren't police that want to shut the bars down. There aren't surgeons that diagnose us as having carpal tunnel and demand that we stop our obsessive scrolling. We don't have the same sense of guilt. We have the law to tell us that drugs are wrong. We have the public stigma and billboards on the highway to tell us gambling addiction is wrong. But is shopping wrong? Is social media wrong? Movies, television, books, music, sports, alcohol, sleeping around. These are all things that our society accepts, approves of, endorses, advertises, expedites, idolizes, capitalizes upon. Society doesn't even really frown upon pornography anymore. Maybe in the office we'd have some serious problems with HR if they ever found the secret not safe for work folder, but if they simply saw the history on our home computer, how much would a normal American even judge us? As long as it wasn't child porn, we probably wouldn't even be on the local news. Besides the normal addictive properties that cause people to seek them out, pornography and autoeroticism have the additional effect of being a sort of safe proxy through which those of us who have suffered sexual trauma can enjoy sexuality. Attraction, arousal, and libido are normal things for humans to feel, but after going through trauma that is sexual in nature, we struggle to experience these feelings in a normal, healthy, and biblically approved way that isn't tainted by our past experiences. By watching or reading pornographic materials or engaging in other solitary behaviors, we interact with sexuality in a controlled manner that all at once arouses us without threatening us and happens absolutely on our terms. We are safe to feel turned on without having to risk interacting with someone else, and the things we feel give us a temporary sense of relief. How much is temporary relief worth, though? Is it worth the way we warp our own thinking? We pour all of these objectifying thoughts and words and scenes into our minds, and it's like a song that gets stuck in our heads. Frankly, it's a little hard to get our minds out of the gutter when we've been waiting in it too long, but we also can't survive in the gutter. We're still afraid of it. Just because we take the interactive element of sexuality out of the equation doesn't mean that it doesn't sort of remind us of the very things that we fear. We want so badly to be in control of our fears that we keep exposing ourselves to it over and over, thinking that it will downplay what happened. Even though we didn't consent to what happened before, even though we have nightmares of what happened before, we may recall that our bodies still responded. That bothers us. Our arousal in that moment seems to downplay the fear we experienced. So, to lend credence to the fear, we prove to ourselves over and over how cheap arousal is. We never really escape it, though. Arousal is cheap. The fact that we have to keep proving it to ourselves, the fact that we have to keep proving that we're in control of our bodies, shows just how scared we still are. We damage ourselves. We are, in effect, abusing our own selves, partly by terrorizing ourselves with the things we didn't really want, partly by reinforcing the cycle of objectification that we were once victims of, partly by internalizing even more misconceptions of what sexuality is supposed to be. The latter becomes a stumbling block for healthy relationships. What do we see sexuality as? We've seen what happened to us. We've seen the grotesque, at times inhuman depictions that the internet and the industry have to offer. We see the worst of sexuality, and it makes it that much more difficult to have any kind of intimacy with anyone. While I don't think physical intimacy is the most important thing in the world, we should have the freedom to choose based on our own tastes and not just be forced to choose by our worst fears. And regardless of whether or not we decide to give a serious relationship a chance, there very well may come a day where we look at a beautiful, normal person and we think something about them that reminds us of what someone else thought about us, and we know it. The things we've seen have changed the way we think, and now we are a person who objectifies others. We become the thing we hate, which is crazy, because the whole reason we gotten into this situation was because we didn't want anything from anyone. In that moment, will we be able to shrug off the guilt? Will we be able to see ourselves as worthy of this person's respect? Will we have any self-respect left? Is injuring our self-esteem worth the relief we get? Is losing our grip on the person we thought we were worth it? Is making our lives worse worth it? The strategy of self-medication is a slippery slope that gets steeper as we go, and one more problem to place on top of all of our other problems. Is it fair that relief is so expensive when it's so short? We feel fleeting euphoria, or numbness, or exhilaration, or calm, or arousal, and for a moment it displaces all or most or some of the negative feelings. For a moment we have heavy-handedly enforced control over our thoughts and emotions. Then it's back to the same old pain. Is the relief of any addiction worth it when it takes so much away? Of course it isn't. There's no net gain for us, and that's why it's called addiction. The word addiction comes from a Latin word that means an awarding, a delivering up. We are addiction's prize. We are awarded to it. We are devoted to it. We serve it. We begin to do things we normally wouldn't do solely to perpetuate the addiction. We no longer act out our own will, but the will of the addiction. As we swing ever more feverishly between relief and desperation, we begin to lose our sense of rationality. We are given to it, consecrated to it. Addiction is not a valid way for us to regain control of our emotions because, by nature, it is something that grows to control us. We're not meant to benefit in this system. We're meant to be used, and unless we sober up, we'll keep using and being used until it uses us up. We sought something to hold ourselves together, and we found a python, not realizing that its embrace is a stranglehold, not realizing how completely we'd be consumed. But we must keep in mind that in the situation I'm describing, addiction is a symptom, not the original problem. Thus, sobering up in and of itself doesn't fix everything for us. It doesn't fix the new problems, and it doesn't fix the old problems either. Even if we can get through the physical repercussions of withdrawal, even if we can bear the physiological consequences of substance abuse, we still have to confront the mental state that led us to addiction in the first place. We probably don't have a lot of experience with healthy coping mechanisms, and because we continue to carry extra baggage, there is a higher likelihood of relapse. Not even because the drug is so great, but because the pain is too much. The pain beats us until we relent again. And we must relent again, because even though everything may hurt worse later, everything hurts now, and now is all we have. The only real way to break free from any addiction that we turn to for relief is to remove our need for relief. Some of us medicate pain with pain. There are many motivations for self-harm, but one reason we may physically harm ourselves is to forcibly bring our minds to the present and overshadow the emotional and mental pain that we feel. Humans tend to focus on the thing that brings us the greatest sense of pain. We don't notice a paper cut when we have a headache. We don't notice a headache when we have a broken arm. We don't focus on the heartache when we are literally bleeding. Of course, there isn't always blood. We can harm ourselves in as many ways as we can think of, and it isn't always the way we imagine self-harm to be. It isn't always someone locked in the bathroom and cutting their wrists. It can be burning, poisoning, bruising, hair plucking, literally anything. It can be something as subtle as quietly pinching ourselves to keep ourselves from being swept up in emotion in a social setting, or refusing treatment when we're ill, or neglecting ourselves and thereby making ourselves sick. It is any source of pain that we use to keep our minds steady when we begin to feel too much. Conversely, we may self-harm not because we're in pain, but because we're numb. Whatever we have gone through has left us incapable of feeling anything. Perhaps because the only way we could survive back then was by suppressing our emotions, or perhaps because the ordeal left us too emotionally exhausted to do anything else. We hurt ourselves just to feel something, anything, and to prove to ourselves that we aren't totally incapable of feeling. Even though we are emotionally flatlining, we know we are still alive, because our pain receptors tell us so. The most obvious issue with self-harm is the physical damage that we incur, and just like with any drug addiction, any miscalculation on our part could leave us permanently damaged or worse. We know that, though. We're not stupid. In fact, we may consciously grapple with the issue of finding comfort in unnecessary physical danger as we engage in self-harm. We still have a lot of mixed feelings about the practice, even as we practice it. For one thing, even though the act of self-harm is to make us feel marginally better, we recognize that it does cause us to feel physically worse, and generally speaking, the human body tends to prioritize pain avoidance. Just because we do it for a purpose doesn't mean we never wince at the pain to come. In addition, there is often tremendous shame that comes with self-harm, because we know that it's counterintuitive and hard to explain to others. After the feeling of release fades, we may get a lingering sense of regret and guilt that adds to our emotional burden. Still, the feelings that we get when we self-harm, the sense of clarity, the sense of presence, the sense of existence, the adrenaline and the exhilaration, can become addicting in and of themselves, even if we never learn to accept the physical pain during and the shame afterwards. Like any other addiction, the high outweighs any possible drawbacks in our minds, and like any other addiction, it never becomes enough. We either fall back into a worse low or chase a high until we can't run anymore. Not all self-harm is physical, however. We say things to ourselves to hurt ourselves. Maybe we've internalized the things that other people have told us, or perhaps we've just drawn our own biased conclusions, but our monologue is a steady stream of self-deprecation. We tell ourselves such awful things sometimes. That we're useless, a burden to everyone, we're messed up, we're hopeless, we're not good enough, not strong enough, not this or that or whatever enough. We feel like if we can just keep our expectations low, if we can just cut ourselves down enough, we'll be so far down that the universe won't notice us and pour out its wrath. If we dismantle our hopes, we don't have to worry about disappointment. If we quit while we're behind, we won't fall further behind. It's not helping us, though. It's stopping us before we can begin. Like physical self-harm, we keep ourselves in a constant state of pain in order to mask the greater pain of uncertainty and insecurity, and it's killing us. If we don't come to terms with our own lack of control, it may literally kill us. Suicide becomes the only exit from a world of constant suffering. Being able to control anything else, we take the power of self-destruction in our hands and say to ourselves, at least I can control this. Suicide is not an end to suffering. Suicide is a sin, in the same way that murder is a sin. It is the unjustified taking of a life. There is technically only one sin that the Bible calls unforgivable, and that is blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. However, suicide, while perhaps not technically unforgivable, is usually unrepentant, and one must repent of a sin in order for it to be blotted out. There isn't much time to repent in the span between when we set suicide into motion and when we succumb to it. There's no time for apologies between the trigger pull and the bullet wound. If we are planning on repenting with our last breath, we plan poorly. And if we miscalculate, as people do when they are no longer thinking logically, we may pass on from what we supposed was hell into the real thing. We have one fleeting moment of control, and then we forfeit any semblance of control for all eternity. In all cases, no matter how we try to manipulate our environment or the people around us or our own selves, the control we've lost isn't something we can regain because it's never something that we had in the first place. The ideal, safe, and predictable world that we are trying to recapture was imaginary, an illusion understandably created by our own inexperience in the world. The idea of a loss of control is a narrative that we create in our own mind in response to our inability to accept our own powerlessness in this life and the danger that it poses to us. Only God is in control. No one else has real control, ever. When we don't have a solid foundation in God, when we don't know how to trust in Him, the notion of powerlessness is terrifying, because it implies that just as we were powerless to stop bad things from happening before, so will we be powerless to stop bad things from happening in the future. Maybe we can try to manipulate certain variables so that the odds are in our favor, but even slim chances of misfortune are chances. We knew that to begin with. We are not masters of our fate, and we exhaust ourselves trying to become something we simply cannot be. Cover-ups. When our old self dies, we are forced to look at the face of someone new in the mirror. It's not a pretty sight. We see things in ourselves that bother us. A light gone out in the eyes, hands too weak to defend ourselves with, legs that couldn't run fast enough, perhaps literal scars, the passage of wasted time etched in our faces and streaking through our hair. All at once, we see our weaknesses right in front of us, and we don't want anyone else to see what we do, so we find ways to cover our flaws. We hide ourselves. Sometimes the easiest way to do this is to hide behind someone or something else. We don't like ourselves anymore, so we no longer identify as who we are, but we identify as what we do and what we do for others. We no longer call ourselves by our name, but by our title. We become known as so-and-so's spouse, so-and-so's parent, such and such company's employee, such and such church's auxiliary leader, etc. We become our friend groups, our institutions, our minorities, our causes. We spend all of our energy serving someone or something else so that we don't have time to look at ourselves. We create a life of being the helper so no one notices that we need help also. It's not that we aren't truly helping people, we are. And that level of loyalty and dedication is certainly admirable. But is our loyalty sustainable? We put ourselves in a place where we're always giving so that people get the impression that we're rich emotionally. But we are actually just overspending ourselves on credit with a growing debt that we never make the payments on. One day we're bound to hit our limit. Maybe we hit our limit when the thing we use to validate ourselves with is removed from us. The company we've put our blood, sweat, and tears into closes down or lets us go. The person our lives revolved around leaves us or turns against us or passes away. Everything in which we invested is stolen from us. When the thing we built our identity on is gone, who are we? Suddenly we are forced to deal with the same us that we didn't want to address. We finally have to go home and look in the mirror again without the mask, and we find ourselves just as repulsive as the last time we'd seen ourselves, or worse. Maybe before that awful day of reckoning, we become self-aware. Someone around us might notice that we don't seem to have a life of our own anymore and may ask us about it, or something turns our focus inward for a brief moment, or we might just become exhausted. We become aware of the richness in other people's lives and begin to wonder how we became so empty of ourselves. We can no longer validate ourselves in what we can do for others because even though the other is still there, we can't find it in ourselves to do anymore. We notice our debt and realize that we have nothing real to give. We have been selfless, but not only in the sense that we have put others before ourselves, but also in the sense that we've erased ourselves. This kind of selflessness is a cheap knockoff of true selflessness. We consider the things we do to be a labor of love, but are they really? What are we sacrificing? We can't sacrifice something we don't value. If our time and our bodies and our identity aren't important to us, We aren't gifting people with them, we're just passing off our refuse to others. We aren't sacrificing, we're trying to force an exchange of our identity for theirs. Because we fail to think about our own selves, we are only giving a weak version of ourselves to rely on. If we were more stable in our own hearts and minds, we could be a more secure support to others. Instead, we neglect ourselves and we falsely advertise our strength to others without thinking of what could happen if we're not as strong as we say we are. We aren't horrible people when we do these kinds of things. Our heart is in the right place. We could have given our energy to anything else, but we probably chose this because it was something or someone we believed in. It's a beautiful thing to want to give as much as we try to. But we can't always live being the help that we wish we had when it's the help that we still need. We don't have the strength to love others when we can't love ourselves or let others love us. If we're not disposed to reinventing ourselves through some other entity, we may go so far as to create a whole new persona, a facade to hide that we were ever a victim. Perhaps we were once very gentle, but now our speech has become more brutal and our interests more morbid and our looks more aggressive, all to appear unapproachable or intimidating. Perhaps we were once very vulnerable, but now we dress and carry ourselves with a certain manufactured confidence. This isn't a matter of actually changing ourselves, but a matter of putting on an act. The person that we truly are self-indulgently writes the, at times, cartoonish script that governs our new character in direct response to the person we see ourselves as. I must emphasize that we aren't recreating ourselves in response to what we truly are, but according to our interpretation of ourselves, however warped that may be. We're not capable on our own of seeing ourselves for what we really are, not capable of understanding the gaps and blind spots in our own self-knowledge. We only know ourselves from one perspective and through the context of our life history. Pain and fear affect our perception, because our instinct is to put additional focus on the things that hurt us or that can hurt us in the future, so that we can better protect ourselves. In a combat situation, this is useful. It is an advantage to be able to hyperfocus on an enemy's actions so that we can properly respond. But most things in life are not combat situations. Confronting ourselves shouldn't be approached like a combat situation. If we have been abused, we don't automatically look at the things that we are outside of the context of abuse, but we focus on the traits that we think made us susceptible to abuse and the traits that resulted from abuse. We use that as a starting point and use our limited self-knowledge to make ourselves into something we think we can be proud of only in that narrow context, and we ignore what we are in a broader context. The misidentification of our cause of pain due to narrow contextualization is a prominent feature in the trans movement. People who struggle with gender dysphoria feel anxiety or discomfort because they feel there is a mismatch between their biological sex and gender identity. Trans people put so much effort into trying to relieve this sense of gender dysphoria. But what happens when a new name isn't enough? What happens when the new clothes aren't enough? What are we supposed to do when gender reassignment surgeries and hormone treatments and voice changes aren't enough and we're still left with a sense of anxiety and self-loathing and depression? What if at the end of the road of self-reinvention we still find the same pain? A big problem with modern strategies to treat gender dysphoria is that they fail to recognize that the greatest issue isn't gender, but dysphoria. We can't possibly know that we're meant to be a different sex because we've never been a different sex. It's not something that we're missing. It's us thinking the grass is greener on the other side. The only thing assured is that we don't know how to love ourselves. Something has happened to us that we don't know how to talk about or how to come to terms with, and because our gender was a key point, because of the emotional repercussions of a society that objectifies women and perpetuates toxic masculinity, because a member of the family or society whose approval we value encouraged or applauded our change of gender and we don't want to admit that we were hungry for their approval, because we defied a gender stereotype that we have internalized, we believe that our gender is the problem. We hone in on the site of immediate pain and believe that it's the only reason we hurt, and we begin to think that changing our gender will solve our problems. We subject ourselves to irreversible procedures in order to conform ourselves to culture's expectations with the hopes that this confirmation will make us feel more secure. We are following the contemporary rules of what masculinity or femininity or society's new philosophy of gender fluidity means, and following rules makes us good, and all of popular opinion pats us on the back and tries to cheer us up when it sees our supposedly comorbid mental struggles. Why do we treat our pain with indulgence in a new persona instead of trying to love what we already are? How is treating gender dysphoria with gender reassignment surgery and transitioning any different than treating anorexia with starvation? Is the loathing we feel for our dead name only because of the disrespect with which people use it, or is it because we associate that old name with pain? Who is the presumptuous agent of society that knew our feelings better than us and told us that our problem is that we were made defective? We live in a society that celebrates the misdiagnosis of gender dysphoria instead of acknowledging the often lucrative broken systems that stop us from feeling validated as a human soul. We live in a society that glamorizes the mistreatment of gender dysphoria and pushes us to bury what we are, and then wants us to stay buried in order to validate these broken systems. We are expected to deal with the remaining depression and anxiety without questioning the efficacy of transitioning and the new stressors it brought us. Despite the shouts of support and validity from popular opinion, there is no comfort for those who regret transitioning. Those that regret are simply depressed or insecure, never mind the fact that they may have just been depressed or insecure in the first place, and they are considered enemies of the contemporary rhetoric surrounding gender dysphoria. The modern rhetoric surrounding homosexuality has similar issues. Society is so quick to say that homosexuals are born that way, but will not even entertain the idea that many people choose homosexuality in direct response to abuse or assault, or in response to grooming, or in response to peer pressure and stereotyping. Homosexuals are often relegated to a lifestyle in which their pain is never properly addressed and thus never properly treated. We are made to follow society's tenets that demand us to be proud of our coping mechanisms, and to forge an identity that revolves around our sexual orientation. We are forced to build ourselves on the concept of sexuality while simultaneously ignoring our own painful experiences with sexuality and the very idea of it. Why is sexuality even important? Sexuality is only the center of someone's life when it is the point that has caused them the greatest pain. Just like gender is the focal point for someone whose gender has been called into question, just like vulnerability is the focal point for an abuse victim, just like preparedness is the focal point for a disaster survivor, just like rejection is the focal point for someone who has been neglected. LGBTQ+ people aren't the only ones who experience this hyper-focus on a narrow aspect of the human experience, but it's an easier metaphor to understand because there is a visible change in their identity and a huge emphasis on it as well. We may not all go so far as to change our gender or dating preferences, but all of us can make our scars into our most distinguishable features. In our minds, we are that abuse victim. We are the one who lost it all. We are the one who witnessed the tragedy. And the person we need to be is an idealized hero that isn't susceptible to such things anymore. A man never has to come to terms with the feeling of emasculation he experienced as a result of another man sexually abusing him if he is gay and beyond the concept of emasculation. A woman never has to deal with the objectification and lookism that comes with being a woman if she stops being a woman and becomes a man. We don't have to fear abuse if everyone's too scared to even look at us wrong. We don't need to be afraid of disaster if we have supplies and safe houses. We don't need to be afraid of neglect if we become loners and heartbreakers. But what are we outside of these things? We don't always know how to answer. We build ourselves up on such narrow foundations that we can't help but be unstable. Do we really just want to be the shadow cast in response to trauma's harsh light? Why are we striving to be the outline of what we are as seen from one angle when we are real multidimensional people? We are more than who we are in the context of the way we've been hurt. We need to give ourselves the chance to work through our pain and the concept of our identity in a well-rounded way instead of making ourselves into a caricatured opposite of our concept of victimhood. Sometimes, instead of becoming our ideal of a stronger person, the persona we create is strikingly similar to the way we used to be, or our nostalgic interpretation of that past version of ourselves. The old us is already dead, but maybe through concerted effort, and make no mistake, it takes considerable effort, we can recreate ourselves in its image. In this way, it doesn't even appear that something bad has happened to us. We try to bypass the trauma completely and attempt to pick up where we left off as if nothing happened. When trauma leaves no visible evidence, looking at ourselves is no less difficult than if we'd been physically scarred. We struggle with the cognitive dissonance of everything looking the same and nothing being the same all at the same time. Instead of accepting the fact that emotional and spiritual pain can drag on after the physical pain is healed, we use physical health to cover up emotional and spiritual injury. No one can see handprints on us, so we can pretend we've never been touched. The harsh words we heard were never recorded and have faded away into the air, so we can pretend they aren't etched into our minds. Our tears have dried, so we can pretend we never shed them. But that's all it is, pretending. And pretending is work. No matter what sort of mask we use, it is a burden to keep it in place. Because we're self-aware and we realize that our current state will reveal our secrets to the world around us, we try to create a facade, but also because we're self-aware, we're incapable of maintaining that facade. We find ourselves constantly on guard as we perpetuate our act, and we often acutely feel the difference between the self we manufacture and the self we truly are. We build this facade with our own hands, and the shadow of doubt behind it grows with every brick that we add. We weren't made to pretend long term. It's not a matter of if someone will see through us, but when. Someday, because life is life, we will be caught with our mask off. Someone will arrive at our metaphorical front door before we've had a chance to fix our face, or a witness that we forgot about will ask the wrong questions. Sometimes, in our overvigilance, we sabotage ourselves by reading too far into things and projecting suspicion onto the people around us. Because we're in a covert frame of mind, we are constantly responding to the things around us, constantly trying to match our camouflage to the changing environment, and every social interaction carries the risk of exposing us if we let our guard down. We may find that most of the time people don't even pose a threat, but because we have to assess the danger over and over, it takes a toll on us until we inevitably reach a breaking point and someone finds out. Defensiveness reveals our fears. To mitigate the toll that our painful method acting takes on our mental state, we often find some kind of crutch. As I discussed earlier, to keep control of our emotions, we may find some substance or pastime to mitigate our bad feelings, and we self-medicate. When we self-medicate in conjunction to putting on a facade of wellness, the chemical dependency becomes integral to our ruse. Without the assistance of our drug, we don't have the energy to hold the mask to our face. Or maybe we have the energy, but because we feel worse overall, we worry about how well we are covering our faces. There comes a paranoia, whether justified or not, that people can see through us. I recall the lyrics to a song that my dad once wrote an analysis on. It's a false sense of accomplishment every time I quit. Everyone can see my every flaw. When we aren't using, we don't have a crutch to hold ourselves up on. We don't have anything to prop up the corners of our fake smiles. And how terrifying it is when people begin to ask the question, "Are you okay?" Sometimes it's no longer about the high anymore. We just need something to bring us back up to normal. Any effort to hide our face is in vain. Our history is like a star that has collapsed on itself and has become a black hole, something so dense that not even light can escape its gravitational pull. The interesting thing about black holes is that they can't be seen with the naked eye. Light itself is pulled into them at such a rate that they are invisible, and the reason that astrologists can locate them is because their gravity affects everything around them so drastically that they become obvious. We struggle so much to hide our pasts, but how can we hide the massive, all-consuming singularity at our core when our whole lives revolve around it so obviously? How do we maintain the speed and the momentum to keep circling around our personal darkness instead of being pulled in? The orbit of an object isn't a sustainable circle anymore when it can't maintain its speed. It's a gradual inward spiral. We are in a situation where we are being slowly pulled closer and closer to a truth we don't want to show. Every move we make becomes another revolution around it, another opportunity for our black hole to be discovered. Every revolution drags us inward at a faster pace than the last. Our habits, the things we do and don't do, the words we say and don't say, our emotional unavailability or our feints at expression, our changes in mood. Even if no one else can see their cause, the people around us begin to understand that there must be something wrong at the center of it all. The mask we wear automatically implies a hidden face. Then, when the exhausting spiral of pretense approaches its inevitable and painful end, we have to choose a world to live in. Do we want to come clean and choose to confront the reality of our situation? Do we stop trying to distance ourselves from the pain in our hearts and move on? Do we find something bigger than our problems that puts the pieces of our lives into a safer orbit that keeps us from collapsing in on ourselves? Or, realizing our narratives are no longer flexible enough to contort to reality, do we reject reality altogether?